on the scripture so you could read the Calvin and Hobbes one.
You're right.
Yes. Well, I understand that in Colombia, in various villages, that street names or streets are organized and named about characters in various books or famous authors. Ernest Hemingway being one of those. Where is Ernest Hemingway's community in Colombia? Here. Well, Ernest Hemingway wrote, I don't know if you know this, but he wrote a series of short stories published in the mid-1930s in a variety of collections. One of those was titled Capital of the World. And it was set mostly in Madrid, in Spain, and focused on bullfighting and matadors. But it starts that short story with a story attributed to a father and his son Paco. And the story goes that Paco and his father had a hard life together, and eventually just simply couldn't live with each other anymore. And Paco, like in a lot of families, we know, over the years, left home, went away, and said, I don't ever want to see my father again. And went away. And the father grieved over this. It's kind of like the prodigal son story in the Gospels. And this father grieved over this for a long, long, long time, and finally came up with a possible creative solution. And he went to the newspaper and put in a little notice in the newspaper that says, to my son Paco, on Tuesday, meet me in front of the Hotel Montana at 12 noon. All is forgiven. I love you, Dad. So the father was obviously anticipating this and excited, and so he went finally on Tuesday to the Hotel Montana to see what would happen. And there were 800 Pacos in front of the hotel, waiting and hoping to see a father who had offered forgiveness. Now, Hemingway doesn't do full justice to this because we all love for stories to be complete. We do not know whether this particular Paco showed up or not. But it's a powerful witness to how much in the world, even with us today, we long for forgiveness, to be forgiven by someone, or we long to have the opportunity to come together with someone so that we can offer our forgiveness to them. Sometimes we have to go to great lengths to do that, so we publish an ad in the paper and hope that someone will show up that we care about. You see, forgiveness and reconciliation are all tied up together. We started this series talking about reconciliation. This Sunday and next Sunday, we're talking about forgiveness. Is it a project in our lives that we do once in a while, or is it a process, a way of life for us? And I think Dr. Luke, in Luke's Gospel, knows this connection between reconciliation and forgiveness, because the whole of chapter 6 is about life and relationships in this new community that the disciples were trying to form, being formed around Jesus and his disciples. In today's text, especially in the full of that text from verse 35 in chapter 6 all the way to 37, Jesus gives very specific instructions about love and the role of forgiveness, the role that forgiveness plays in living loving lives. Jesus is very, very specific. He says, you are rewarded by showing radical love and forgiveness that comes in relating honestly with your enemy. Jesus usually, gives rather straightforward, positive behavioral instructions. Unlike the Ten Commandments, which all say, do not do this, and do not do that, and do not do this. But in this text, Jesus chooses a little bit the negative. He says, do not judge. Do not condemn. Indeed, in doing just the opposite, he says, you will receive good outcomes. And in return, affirm your enemy. Lift up and encourage that person for whom you hold a resentment, for whom you are forgiven. By the way, just as an aside, I recall that Lewis Smead, the late Lewis Smead, was has a very interesting name nonetheless, was a great theologian and wrote a lot about forgiveness. He said, how do you know when you've forgiven somebody? How do you know what forgiveness looks like? Is when you can start encouraging that person. And Jesus is suggesting that. Affirm, lift up a person, the opposite of condemnation and judgment. Indeed, in doing the opposite of these two things, Jesus is saying to us, things come out well, things come out better. But you know what? I get to do this. Jesus was either really idealistic, if not radical, and he was, or maybe sometimes a little naive, you know? If you don't judge others, they won't judge you, he says. If you don't condemn others, they won't condemn you. You ever had that experience? Sometimes, but ultimately I believe this is true, but it doesn't always work that way in the short term, does it, my friends? Sometimes we try to treat another person the way we want to be treated, and they just won't do that. They just won't come across. Yet we keep trying. Ultimately, though, I believe this is true, but it doesn't always work out that way. But I think in this case, Jesus is really speaking, as he almost always does, is speaking in an unconditional sense. He's not putting conditions on anything. His radical forgiveness is always unconditional. You know, I forgive you. I love you. Unconditionally. But we have so much of this today in our society and in our world. In global politics, President Obama gets beat up all the time by some on the other side because he won't say radical Islamists, or he won't say radical Islamic violence. He won't say it in the way they want him to say it. He won't judge and condemn all Muslims because of a few. And it gets tricky. Locally and regionally and nationally in this country, Black Lives Matter to those who are African American is a really important, powerful statement. This is an important image, but yet many others say, oh, but all lives matter. You know, yes, all lives matter, but in this case, and in a lot of cases, Black lives really matter, and until we can come to terms with that, especially as privileged white folks, it's a complicated matter. So don't condemn us because you say one particular group matters more than the other. You know, in the transgender community these days, all across the country, people are really, really struggling to be able to come out, to find a restroom that they're welcome to go to. But yet, there are people who so easily condemn someone who has been struggling and wrestling with their gender identity, or maybe all of their lives, or at least since a recognition around 3 or 4. And they want to be accepted and received and affirmed, not condemned and judged. I think these are the kinds of things about which Jesus is concerned in this text, that love will overcome hurt and resentment, and through conversation and through honest and straight talk, our relationships will be mended and made whole again. Forgiveness, you see, is at the heart of this process. that Jesus presents in this text and in the Gospel of Luke. Loving forgiveness is what makes reconciliation in our lives happen. We all yearn to receive it, don't we? We all need to learn how to give it. Well, I hope and pray that by the time you leave this worship today, that you will have a deeper sense of what reconciliation and forgiveness might look like, and also to become more committed to it as an ongoing process in your life and moving toward wholeness and peace. So is forgiveness a specific project that we accomplish from time to time when there is one person or another who really needs to forgive us or needs to be forgiven? Or is it an ongoing, living, dynamic, sometimes painful process in which we engage with God, with ourselves, and with each other? I suppose it's ultimately both, but I pose that as a question to us. To live a life of faith in any tradition or context involves forgiveness at the very foundation of it all. Of all the marks of a faithful life, joy and peace and patience and kindness and faithfulness, generosity, forgiveness stands right at the heart of all of it. Our being forgiven and our being forgiven people. In the letter to the Ephesians, there's a whole sermon in this, and I don't have the time to give it, but it addresses the interesting issue of anger and resentment. What is the writer of Ephesians? Probably not, most definitely not Paul, but whoever that writer is addressing the people who, in a church in Ephesus that's trying to be the church, addressing to them about this whole issue of reconciliation. These new churches that were being formed by Paul had a tough time. They didn't know how to live together. They didn't know what forgiveness looked like. They didn't know what cooperation looked like. And so the writer is, in this letter to the church at Ephesus, is addressing that. And what does he say? You can be angry. You know? Claim you're angry. Own it. But you can only have it during the day, because he said, and it says be angry, but do not sin. And then suggests that the sinning part of anger is going to bed angry. Don't let the sun set on your anger. We've heard that. I mean, that's something some of us say. We say it, but we wake up angry. So there's a whole lot of sinning going on at night in our beds when we haven't let go of those things which we are angry about, or resentments which we hold. Sometimes we have dreams. You ever have a dream when you wake up? And you dream, maybe the dream you think it's just right before you wake up, and you're just as angry as you can be at the one lying next to you in bed because they did something really awful in the dream. Maybe. I never ever do that. It says, do not grieve the Holy Spirit. Put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander, together with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ has forgiven you. That's what the writer says in Ephesians. But how easily we can do wrong, or say a word that hurts, or hold on to a resentment without talking it out, or not telling another how something they said hurt us. Folks, I'm talking about one of the most important projects of our lives, really. In love, telling the truth to another, to ourselves even, that we might have reconciled relationships and lives, that we might be the very best we can be together. In our homes, in our families, in our communities, in our offices, in our churches, in our community. This means dealing with each other, especially right here in this community called Columbia United Christian Church, in ways that are honest and open. Avoiding conflict so we won't hurt someone's feelings. Not saying something that that we might say because you don't want to offend someone? Not knowing whether it'll offend them or not, but we sort of make the decision for them. We'll just simply hold back so we don't upset someone. Owning your anger in ways that straight talk that Jesus and the writer in Ephesians are talking about. Owning your anger or your struggle or your frustrations with someone else in ways that allow you to use words couched in tender-heartedness and kindness that hold others accountable. It's important in our families, right? We go to great strides to parent that way with our kids. I'm inviting you, as your interim pastor, to go to great strides to practice that as a congregation as well, as we move into the future. I love the Calvin and Hobbes stories. I have books of Calvin and Hobbes. One of my grandsons, Nicholas, out in Colorado, loves them, and I used to have more, but he wanted some of mine. And Calvin says to Tiger, I repeat, Hobbes, I feel bad that I called Susie names and hurt her feelings. I'm sorry I did it. He's telling Hobbes this. He's not talking to Susie. But Hobbes suggests, well, maybe you should try to apologize to her. Calvin ponders this for a moment and replies, I keep hoping there's a less obvious solution. You heard that again? Don't we all? Can we identify with Calvin? I can't, even though mostly I don't hold on to grudges and resentments. I used to practice it once in a while because I felt like there was some that I should keep and hold on to. But it's quite tempting at times. Taking a grudge to bed just feeds our resentments and disrupts even our best relationships and our sleep and our rest. Mpho Tutu, who is an Anglican priest, used to be an Episcopal priest in Alexandria, Virginia, but now leads, along with her father, Desmond Tutu, a center in South Africa for reconciliation and spiritual renewal. I had the wonderful opportunity some years ago to study with Mpho at the National Cathedral about reconciliation. And she says that resentment keeps us hitched up to the person who has offended us. Keeps us hitched to them. Emotionally connected and hitched to them. Rather than having to deal with them directly. This seems to give us some sort of adrenaline rush, she says. It keeps the drama going. It can puff us up as being better than the others sometimes. If we can just keep thinking about how we think about that person and what a bad person they are and how good we are. And we get taller and bigger and more important and more intelligent and brighter as we build on this and feed this kind of resentment. This is illustrated tragically by a poem by Stanley Kunitz, one of my favorite poets. In this poem called The Portrait, and this is not for young kids' ears necessarily. My mother never forgave my father for killing himself, especially at such an awkward time in a public park that spring when I was waiting to be born. She locked his portrait in my hand of a long-lipped stranger with a brave mustache and deep brown level eyes. She ripped it into shreds without a single word and slapped me hard. In my 64th year, I can feel my cheek still burning. It's almost like I can feel my cheek burning from a mother who slaps a grown son because he dared show her a picture of someone she never, ever, ever could forgive. I know that sometimes we aren't willing to forgive, and others aren't willing to forgive us because the offense is too great, Or we're just not ready. Or we've waited too long. We've spent too many dark nights feeding this issue in our lives. And yet we feel the weight of the grievance. So there is this wise saying that maybe you've heard, and I don't know who said it, but I wish it were my original words. It says, holding on to resentment is like taking poison and hoping the other person will die. Listen, my friends, there is enough scientific and medical evidence today to suggest that holding on to resentments and being unwilling to forgive ultimately will kill us. Spiritually, mentally, and perhaps even physically. Holding on to resentment eats at us, robs us of our true humanity. Our freedom confines us to living in the past and separates us from one another, from our true self, and even from God. And that's what Jesus knows and cares about in this text from Luke this morning. That's what Mpho Tutu teaches in her work. That reconciling with one another for an offense or hurt brings us close again, but close in a positive and loving way. It brings us closer to God. Now, we may never end up standing in line with 800 other Pacos, hoping to reunite and receive the forgiveness of a loving Father. Yet I would imagine that for most of us here have some unfinished business, some unfinished and unresolved issues begging for forgiveness and reconciliation in our lives. I do. And I imagine that each one of us here does. I suggest to you today that some homework might be in order. Is there someone you need to go to and offer forgiveness for something you've done or said? Do you need to do what Jesus suggests and go to another person who has hurt you and made you angry and tell them about that hurt? Perhaps you are hurting and need to share that someone you care enough about to tell them that. Or maybe you just need to forgive yourself. I do. My friends, these are really profound spiritual questions for you, for all of us, and even for this church community. May we deal with them with care and tender-hearted kindness this day.